By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe felt close to its end for many Americans. France had been liberated, Allied forces were advancing eastward, and German resistance seemed increasingly desperate. Soldiers spoke quietly about being home by the next year. Officers planned for final pushes, not last stands. What few realized was that, far from surrendering, Germany was preparing one final, brutal strike. Adolf Hitler had wagered everything on surprise. He chose the Ardennes forest, a region of thick woods, narrow roads, and steep valleys. Allied commanders believed it was unsuitable for large armored movements and left it lightly. Defended, winter storms would shield German movements from Allied air power. Speed would do the rest. When the offensive began on December 16th, it hit with overwhelming force. German artillery tore into American positions before dawn. Infantry followed, supported by tanks rolling through fog and snow. Entire units were pushed back, some shattered within hours. Roads filled with retreating troops, refugees, and wounded men, amid the chaos. One location became critical almost immediately. Bastogne. The town itself was small, quiet, surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests. Under normal circumstances, it would have been little more than a crossroads, but in wartime, crossroads meant control. 7 major roads converged there. Feeling movement in every direction through the Ardennes, German armor could not continue its advance without Bastogne. American forces could not regroup if it fell. Orders were rushed. The 101st Airborne Division was pulled from rest and sent toward the town with almost no preparation. They were paratroopers, elite by reputation. But they arrived without the tools normally required to hold ground against armored divisions. Winter clothing was scarce. Heavy artillery was absent, ammunition stocks were thin, as they moved. Into position, the cold became impossible to ignore. Snow covered the ground. The wind cut through uniforms. Some men wrapped newspapers round their legs for warmth. Others stuffed rags into boots that were never meant for freezing temperatures. They dug into the frozen earth where they could, scraping shallow holes that offered little protection. German forces moved quickly to encircle the town. Roads were cut one by one. By December 21st, Bastogne was sealed off completely. The Americans inside understood what that meant. There would be no retreat, no easy resupply. Whatever they had would need to last. Artillery fire began almost immediately. German guns pounded the town day and night. Buildings collapsed under repeated barrages. Fires burned unchecked. Civilians huddled in cellars alongside wounded soldiers. Medical stations overflowed. Surgeons worked in near darkness, their hands stiff from the cold, making decisions no one should have to make. Who could be saved? Who could not? Morphine ran out. Bandages were reused. Blood froze on floors on the perimeter. Soldiers fought to hold thin defensive lines stretched across forests and fields. Foxholes were shallow, offering little shelter from shell fragments or the cold. Men slept sitting up, if they slept at all. Weapons jammed. Fingers went numb. Frostbite spread silently. German infantry probed constantly, testing for weakness. Tanks followed, pushing against American positions. Sometimes close enough for soldiers to hear engines idling in the dark. Every night felt longer than the last. Every dawn brought another attack. On December 22nd, German officers approached the American lines under a white flag. They carried a formal demand for surrender. The message was clear and cold. Resistance was pointless. Bastogne was surrounded. Continued fighting would only result in unnecessary loss of life. The demand reached Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. He read it, stared at it for a moment, and replied with a single word: nuts. It was not a speech. It was not dramatic. It was simply the truth. There was nowhere to go. The only option left was to hold. The German response was immediate. Artillery fire intensified. Infantry assaults grew more aggressive. Attacks came through the forests, across open ground, sometimes through the rubble of shattered neighborhoods. American units fought side by side regardless of designation. Paratroopers held positions with engineers. Clerks carried ammunition. Cooks fired rifles from foxholes. Rank mattered less than survival. Casualties mounted. Stretcher bearers moved constantly, slipping on ice, dragging wounded men through snow and mud. The sound of artillery never fully stopped. It became part of the landscape, as constant as the wind. Then, on December 23rd, the sky changed. Clouds broke. For the first time in days, the weather cleared, engines echoed overhead. Allied aircraft appeared above Bastogne, filling the sky with movement. Parachutes opened, drifting down with supplies the defenders desperately needed: ammunition, food, medical equipment. Not every drop landed where it was meant to. Some fell into German positions, but enough reached American hands to make a difference. Men shared rations. Weapons were reloaded. The line stabilized. Outside the town, relief forces were moving. General George S. Patton had turned his Third Army north in a maneuver that defied expectations. Roads were clogged. Conditions were brutal. But the advance continued. On December 26th, American tanks finally broke through German lines and reached Bastogne. The siege was cracked open. The defenders were no longer alone. Fighting continued in the days that followed. But the danger of collapse had passed. German momentum faded. The offensive stalled and then failed. Bastogne remained in American hands. When the battle ended, the town barely resembled what it had been weeks earlier. Buildings were shattered, streets were cratered. The surrounding countryside was torn apart by shellfire and trenches. Thousands lay dead or wounded. Those who survived did not speak much about what they had endured. They were exhausted beyond words, but they understood what had happened. In a place few had heard of before the war, they had stopped something far larger than themselves. They had held when logic said they should break. They had endured when comfort no longer existed. And because they did, the course of the war was changed.